The Star Wars galaxy after the Battle of Endor had a whole bunch of factions vying for territorial control. So I've made a Sankey diagram showing all of the major territorial moves between Episode 6 and the end of the Legends timeline. If you don't know how these charts work, the sides of each faction's color-coded section shows off its relative size over time compared to the other factions, and the flows between these lines show whose territory is coming from where. For example, in this first highlighted section, we can see all of the territory from the Rebellion and some of the territory from the Empire coming together to form the New Republic as it was by the time of the liberation of Coruscant, 7 years after the Battle of Yavin, or 7 ABY. In order to not overcomplicate it, I've mostly stuck to large breakpoints in the timeline, in most cases being yearly territorial changes for the biggest factions. And we are sticking to some of the larger factions, which is still gonna be a lot. On top of this growth of the rebellion, the death of the Emperor also led to the fracturing of the Imperial territory between different warlord groups. While the Empire still controlled Coruscant under Grand Vizier Sate Pestage until our first breakpoint, and many of these other warlord groups still paid at least lip service to him and the Imperial ruling council, in practice many warlords had carved out large chunks of independent territory for themselves, often in open conflict with each other. One of these groups, the Ariado Authority, was run by General Sander Delvardist, based out of Tarkin's homeworld, Ariado. Proximity to early rebel campaigns led to many losses at planets like Morja, where Delvardist lost his Praetor-class flagship Thalassa, though it was overzealous attempts by Delvardist to expand against rebel strongholds like Sullust against the wishes of Ariado's elite, which lost him his territory in the end, causing him to abandon the Outer Rim entirely and have the dubious honor of being the first major warlord pushed entirely into the Deep Core. Or at least the first one whose territory didn't already just start there, like another of our warlords who doesn't get heavily involved in the fighting against the early New Republic, Admiral Blitzer Harsk's Zero Command. Another group, the Pennistar Alignment, under the leadership of Grand Moff Ardus Kane, carved out a swath in the northern Outer Rim and made a similar decision to stay out of the early fighting. They largely planned to bide their time, aside from some border skirmishes with other Imperials, and this would pay off over the years with their territory becoming the core of the remaining Imperial territory by the end of the war with the New Republic, but we'll get there later. A series of agreements between Imperial leadership and local corporate interests led to some new developments like the bespoke Enforcer-class picket ships made by Koa Drive Yards and Galantro Heavy Works on the planet Jamis for Kane's new forces. Next, Warlord Zsinj controlled portions of the Outer Rim and Mid-Rim heading towards the core, just clockwise of the Pennistar alignment in the galaxy. In the early years, Zsinj was arguably the most powerful and the largest of the warlords, making everyone wonder why his territory didn't just eat the other ones, although he benefited from being relatively far from initial Rebel and New Republic campaigns, much like the Pennistar alignment had. One force that had been under his control during the Galactic Civil War, the Crimson Command, built around a core of pink-hulled Victory-class Star Destroyers, which had been built as a result of a material shortage, was absconded with by another warlord, Admiral Trayton Teradok, who used it to build both a rivalry with Zsinj and a neighboring warlord kingdom, the Greater Maldruud, named for its capital in the Maldruud sector. There were a plethora of other smaller warlords running around the galaxy, but rather than have a bunch of single-pixel lines, I've grouped them together in one category here. And maybe a little slim for what it is, but hopefully still gives a general idea of what's going on in the galaxy. Over the year or so following the fall of Coruscant, Sate Pestage had been replaced by Intelligence Director Isan Isard and the Imperial Ruling Council, in charge of, once again, somewhat divergent parts of the Empire. Isard fled Coruscant aboard the Superstar Destroyer Lucenkia and established herself on Typhera, while Ars Dangor and the ruling council moved to Orinda. Despite Isard stopping the flow of Bacta, a crucial medical supply, from Typhera and making herself a target of Rogue Squadron, who resigned their commissions in the New Republic to focus on taking her down, the bulk of the New Republic turned its attention towards Warlord Zsinj. On top of his Imperial territory, Zsinj had effectively annexed or subjugated the corporate sector at some point following Endor. The corporate sector had been an autonomous zone within the Empire, established by loyalist corporations during the Clone Wars, and given mostly carte blanche to exploit the territory at the tail end of one of the galaxy's main hyperlanes, the Hydean Way. The corporate sector had enjoyed a certain level of autonomy even under the Empire, but now it was being used as a base for some of Zsinj's questionable science projects. For example, in Project Minefield, Zsinj tried to brainwash non-humans within the New Republic to compulsively complete some kind of act for him, those acts usually ending in either murder or explosions. The campaigns against Zsinj actually included some cooperation between the New Republic under Han Solo and Imperial forces under Admiral Terran Rogris. But following the death of Zsinj and the destruction of his flagship, the Iron Fist, at the Battle of Dathomir, the alliance of his enemies fell apart about as quickly as his territory did. It was, however, the start of a newer and much longer-lasting alliance between the New Republic and another independent faction we haven't talked about yet, the Hapes Consortium. They were an insular, matriarchal society which had weathered the Imperial rule of the galaxy by patrolling the Transitory Mists, a nebula surrounding their home star cluster with their iconic clamshell-shaped battle dragons. Their attempts to form an alliance with the New Republic were essentially their first overtures towards the wider galaxy in millennia, alongside their attempts to like this video and subscribe for more, something you can do as well. Not only were the New Republic and Empire rushing to conquer as much as they could of Zinj's territory, the Greater Maldrude now tried to swoop in, and the CSA eventually re-emerged as an independent entity we won't hear from for a few decades now as well, basically splitting Zinj's territory 4 ways. There were still conflicts between those that were doing the carving. Rogris and the Imperials faced Teridoc and the Greater Maldrude in a decisive battle at Fair Eye Junction, ending in Teridoc's favor and knocking the Empire out of the race, but this victory was short-lived for the Greater Maldrude, as Akbar soon countered Teridoc at Meridoun and Thanos, forcing Teridoc out of the Mid-Rim and securing most of Zinj's and Teridoc's former territory for the New Republic. For those keeping track, this now means the Pentastar alignment basically had the only significant amount of territory of any warlord outside of the Deep Core. Traitan Teridoc and his greatly diminished forces linked up there in the Deep Core with his brother Kosh Teridoc, forming the new Federated Teridoc Union, a grandiose name for yet another largely impotent core warlord. Technically, with Kosh's help, Traitan was able to hold on to some mid-rim worlds, but it really wasn't a significant amount. Before continuing down the timeline too far, there's a few other groups to mention. The Hutts in Hutt space were largely independent during the Empire, but they fully threw off any pretense of control after the Emperor's death, and they continued their rule of the criminal underworld of the galaxy unabated, along with the control of their own dedicated worlds. The Unknown Regions also have a few things worth talking about in the time between Endor and 9ABY. As the name implies, we don't actually know much about what's there to talk about, but a few groups relevant to the wider galaxy did exist, and they show up in some stories. First is of course the Chiss Ascendancy, the original faction of Grand Admiral Thrawn. Their territory remains relatively static throughout most of Star Wars, and they'll mostly start getting involved in stories in later periods. Next is the Siruvi Imperium. This species of spacefaring dinosaurs had been taking some outlying Imperial worlds to use the human populations as fuel in their soul-powered technology. Within days of Endor, elements of the Rebel fleet and the Imperial Defense Force at the planet Bakura teamed up and fought off a preliminary Siruvi assault, leading to a multi-year campaign by the Rebels and New Republic to remove them from their newly acquired worlds, reaching their homeworld of Luak, only to find another group had beaten them to it. This had been done by the Empire of the Hand, a faction originally established by Thrawn in cooperation between some Imperials and some Chiss assets during Thrawn's exile from the Empire. While ostensibly established as a way for the Empire to scout and maybe pacify, in their words, parts of the Unknown Regions, Thrawn grew the Empire of the Hand far beyond that in cooperation with various local species as well, which is what the inflow charts here are meant to represent. Over time, it would slowly grow to cover a massive amount of territory in the Unknown Regions, geared mostly towards mutual defense against a variety of other threats existing in that region. Some of these threats, as well as the extragalactic invaders like the Nagai and Toph, who the Rebels fought alongside the Mandalorians in the early years after Endor, may qualify for some level of inclusion on this chart if I were to follow up with a slightly more granular look, depending on people's interest. But generally in those cases, they're either too small, didn't conquer enough territory over long enough of a time, or there's just not enough information to really work with. If you do want to see a deeper follow-up, let me know in the comments though. Getting back to the known galaxy as we head into 9ABY, this is the year where Thrawn himself took over the Empire and launched his campaigns against the New Republic. Over the course of this campaign, a massive proportion of the New Republic territory was taken by him, and he actually gained the tacit support of many remaining Imperial warlords. However, it was over almost as quickly as it started, once the Grand Admiral was assassinated by his bodyguard Rook. And the New Republic followed up quickly with a campaign against the Kutruk Hegemony, a small section of northern Imperial territory, hoping to prove to the galaxy that the Thrawn Campaign hadn't left them in a weaker position than before. Meanwhile, Palpatine was beginning to show himself once again in the Deep Core, after slowly calling more and more Imperials together to serve him once again out of Biss. Infighting between Imperials had been both allowed and encouraged to weed out the weak, or more likely waste a massive amount of personnel and material. But nonetheless, during Operation Shadowhand, Palpatine was able to bring together all of the major Warlord groups in an attack against the ill-prepared New Republic, conquering Coruscant among hundreds, if not thousands, of other worlds. Unfortunately for him and his many cloned bodies, he was repeatedly killed, and one of his many new superweapons, the Galaxy Gun, destroyed Biss. This broke the Empire up once again, probably in a messier way than I could realistically show on a chart like this. The Pentastar alignment actually kept its pre-Shadowhand territory, although Kane himself had been killed, making the alignment really the only Warlord state to survive the death of its founder as well. Zero Command also made out pretty decently here, having seemingly gained control over some of the southern galactic territory out in the Atreus sector, though there's definitely some interpretation involved there. Regardless, it didn't last long, and soon Blitzer Harsk was back to being an exclusively deep-core warlord along with almost everyone else. Albeit now, he was probably the biggest fish in an ever smaller pond. I have very rudely grouped Delvardas of Ariadu and the Federated Pterodoc Union as other warlords here, but frankly, they should thank me for that. In the wake of Palpatine's death, the Empire and the ruling council fell under the short-lived sway of the former Royal Guard Karnor Jax. But the next big impacts didn't come until 12 ABY, when Natasi Dala and Gilad Pellaeon united the warlords at the Sauce Beacon Conference, convincing them into the spirit of cooperation by killing them all and taking all of their stuff. Dala then began an ill-fated campaign against the New Republic, losing her flagship Knight Hammer, which she had taken from Delvardas, before passing military leadership of the United Empire's forces over to Pellaeon. This period also saw the annexation of the Pentastar alignment, albeit with much less bloodshed than the Sauce Conference, at least as far as we know. Over the next few years, until 17 ABY, there were a few campaigns resulting ultimately in a much smaller final territory for the Empire, despite some early victories by Pellaeon, but the situation had largely stabilized. This is when we get to our only remaining unhighlighted line from these earlier periods. The Duscan League, a new, conquering, warlike government formed by the Avethan species in the Coronat cluster after the death of the Emperor, also emerged and was quickly shut down by the New Republic during the Black Fleet Crisis. Not much territory changed hands in the conflict between the New Republic and the Avethans, but the Avethans had been conquering most of their home cluster. So it was a long build-up and kind of quick finish for the Duscan League, though there was still some semblance of a Avethan government after this. The next year, there was an attempt to hijack the Corellian government and secede by Han's cousin and evil doppelganger Thraken Zal Solo, involving the activation of the ancient Centerpoint Station, which was used to create a huge interdiction field around the Corellian system and ultimately the sector, which the New Republic was able to defeat with the help of Bakuran technology, allowing them to jump into the interdiction field and face the Corellians. Han and Leia's kids, Jacen, Jaina, and Anakin Solo, also helped to shut the station down. By 19 ABY, Pellaeon realized it was foolish to think the Empire could hope to overcome the New Republic and tried to sue for peace, despite opposition from many within the Imperial government, including a plot to fake a return by Grand Admiral Thrawn. Funnily enough, this coincided with the possible real return for Grand Admiral Thrawn had Luke and Mara not ventured into the unknown regions, met with the still-growing Empire of the Hand, and killed a gestating Thrawn clone under their capital building. While some other small warlords would continue to pose problems, this largely remained the galactic status quo for 6 more years. The next big changes started in 25 ABY, when a brand new threat emerged in the galaxy. The Yuuzhan Vong and their biotechnology arrived from the intergalactic void, and quickly began to conquer massive amounts of Outer Rim and Mid-Rim territory, primarily from the New Republic, but also increasingly encroaching on Hutt space, despite early attempts by the Hutts to cooperate with the invaders. Pellaeon and the Empire, along with several New Republic military leaders and the Jedi, recognized the massive threat posed by the Yuuzhan Vong. However, the governments on Coruscant and the Imperial capital of Bastion didn't quite accept the gravity of the situation. The New Republic continued to sustain heavy losses until 28 ABY, when the fall of Coruscant shattered any illusions of safety the Empire and the Core still maintained. This brought about the formation of a new government, the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances, put together primarily between what remained of the New Republic, the Empire, and the Hapens. The Hutts continued to hold out in Butana Hutta, the Garden of the Hutts, which had remained the home of their core defense fleets for millennia, even when they had otherwise disarmed. While the Hutts were barely weathering the storm, the new Galactic Alliance was able to turn the tide of the war and finally liberate Coruscant once again. This, along with the discovery of a living world named Zonema Sikot, which had originated in the Vong's home galaxy, brought the war to a close when the Vong were given the planet to live on. They were basically just loaded up and the planet flew away. It wasn't exactly a clean victory though. Some planets were completely uninhabitable thanks to the Yuuzhan Vong, including the former worlds of the Yuvithans who had been entirely exterminated. Despite the Yuuzhan Vong War Master Nash Choka's surrender, many Yuuzhan Vong commanders would refuse to follow suit, a problem Choka promised the remaining Yuuzhan Vong fleet under his command would assist in solving. Unfortunately, this plot point basically never gets mentioned again, so I just assume it happened uneventfully and pretty efficiently in the 6 years between the New Jedi Order books, which are about the Yuuzhan Vong War, and Troy Denning's Dark Nest trilogy, which followed it up chronologically. This trilogy is where we see focus move into the unknown regions, where the Chiss Ascendancy is dealing with territorial encroachments by the Killiks, a species of usually peaceful insects who basically turn people into joiners if they spend too much time around them, which makes them become part of their hive mind. This had happened with a Jedi named Raynar Thal and 2 Dark Jedi, Lomi Plo and Welk, who had been lost during a mission in the Yuuzhan Vong War. Lomi and Welk's influence had created the Gorog, the secret Dark Nest, and led to massive rapid expansionism among the Killiks and reprisals from the Chiss. The capture of Raynar, now known as Unuthal, the public face of the Killik Nest, and the death of Lomi and Welk finally returned the Killiks to their normal, peaceful state and prevented the war from spilling over into the rest of the galaxy. Luckily for Del Rey's ability to keep publishing books, the rest of the galaxy didn't need much help to cause more conflict. The Corellian insurrection of 18 ABY had presaged other issues within the New Republic and then Galactic Alliance, and in 40 ABY, Corellia began another galactic civil war, leading a confederation of other disaffected members of the Alliance in revolt. The Corellians were joined by other members like the Bothans and elements of the Hapens known as the Heritage Council, who were opposed to Queen Mother Tenel Ka, but they were also supported by groups outside of the Galactic Alliance, including the Hutts and the corporate sector, who had managed to largely avoid the Yuuzhan Vong War. During this war, the Galactic Alliance was taken over by Jacen Solo, who would become the Sith Lord Darth Caedus, leading the Alliance to split even further with the formation of the Jedi Coalition, which included the Jedi, elements of the Empire, the Hapens, the Mandalorians, and even some former members of the Confederation. Basically, anyone who decided they hated Jacen Solo more than they hated each other. The war ended at the Battle of Auroru Station, where Jaina Solo killed her brother, which also forced a peace between the Galactic Alliance and the Confederacy, who saw the writing on the wall with the Empire and the rest of the Galactic Alliance now fully arrayed against them. However, notably, the Confederacy was not forced to rejoin the Alliance, and it remained an independent state, or collection of states. The Hapens under Tenel Ka and the Empire under the new leadership of Jagged Fel also withdrew from this increasingly less fittingly named Galactic Alliance. The Fate of the Jedi series, which followed up that conflict which was covered in Legacy of the Force, included less of a galactic conflict and more of an existential crisis for the galaxy, as many of its inhabitants fought Abeloth, who was basically an immortal dark side chaos being, who'd been trapped by Centerpoint Station and its sister station, Sinkhole, in the Maw. For our purposes though, there was a power struggle in 44 ABY for leadership of the Empire. Dalla, who had ended up as the chief of state of the Galactic Alliance, and yes, this is the same woman we talked about reuniting the Empire earlier, had been removed from that position and decided that it would be best to try to wrest control of the Empire from Jagged Fel, amassing her forces at Exodo II. Jag had been informed of this by a Moff who had been spying on Dalla for him, told Gateles, who had dabbled in warlordism himself in his younger days. Jeg was able to mount an attack using not only his own loyalist forces, but forces he was able to pull from the Empire of the Hand, having been raised among the Chiss and trained as an Empire of the Hand pilot. The Empire of the Hand is a pretty messy place lore-wise after the Yuuzhan Vong War, with a lot of authors not really agreeing how it worked, and some amount of contradictory in-universe accounts for whether it still existed. But it seems like it had just been laying dormant for an occasion like this. I would say it's most likely a loose alliance of local forces, with the Imperial and Chiss assets having been allowed to live in Chiss territory and keeping that alliance together. Full annexation by the Chiss of the Empire of the Hand would never have really made any sense, since the Chiss were way too xenophobic to really want that much to do with the big collection of other species Thrawn amassed for the Empire of the Hand. But it's potentially reasonable that some of the outer Empire of the Hand territory may have been directly incorporated into the new empire under Jagged Fel, or the Fel Empire as it would later become known. This is largely the state the galaxy is left in as of Crucible, the final Legends novel chronologically. However, the Legacy comics jump ahead about 80 years, giving us another look at the galaxy starting in 127 ABY. By this point, the Confederacy had been brought back into the Galactic Alliance, or in the case of the Hutts, struck back out on their own, assuming the Hutts hadn't already been in that position much earlier. We really don't have a timeline on the Confederacy's dissolution. The Hapens, though, still did remain independent. The galaxy at this point retained its negative views of the Yuuzhan Vong from the Vong War a century earlier, which the Jedi hoped to rehabilitate by enlisting the Yuuzhan Vong in their biotech to help restore some of the planets devastated during that war. Interference by the Sith caused this project, the Ossus Project, to go horribly wrong. This was interpreted by many as a renewed Yuuzhan Vong attack, and the Galactic Alliance was divided. The Fel Empire declared war on the Galactic Alliance, urged on by the Moffs despite reluctance from a skeptical Emperor Rowan Fel. Over the course of the next 3 years, the Empire quickly took over most of the Alliance's territory, while many systems wanted to secede from the Alliance once again. At the conclusion of the war, achieved due to the helpful intervention of Darth Krayt and his Sith in service of the Empire, Krayt deposed Fel and took over, leaving himself in charge of most of the galaxy, opposed only by the Galactic Alliance remnant and the Empire in exile over the course of the Second Imperial Civil War from 130 to 138 ABY. The Jedi Order was once again nearly wiped out during the Legacy period, but Cade Skywalker, a descendant of Luke, was able to kill Darth Krayt and the Galactic Alliance reformed. This was now normally referred to as the Galactic Federation, which is still part of the same Galactic Federation of Free Alliance's name, which just used to go by Galactic Alliance. And after nearly 100 years away, the Empire rejoined the Alliance, which was now led by a triumvirate with a representative from the Jedi Order, the Alliance, and the Empire. The Legacy comics are followed up by Legacy 2, set from 138 to 140 ABY, and include a new insurgency led by Darth Red, but I don't think they had a major territorial change in this period, and to be entirely honest, it's probably the series and legends I know the least about, so it's best if I don't pretend to. Thank you for watching though. I hope you've enjoyed this excuse to make a chart which has taken most of my time over the last little while. I want to once again thank you all for the support this year, and ask that if you have enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like and subscribe as we head into 2024.